forest and you tell them stories to make them very nervous for the whole the rest of the night. And at that point you know there is a God. But I had been telling this particular story, which is a documented ghost story from Colorado. And I had been telling it for a while, and then a few years ago, my husband and I took a vacation, one of those wonderful vacations where wherever we were, that's where we were. And we came across a range, and we saw this huge valley, and we were driving down the road, and I'm a kind of a map fiend. And I was looking at the maps and going, John, there's Buckskin Creek, and there's Buckskin Hollow, and there's, oh, John, this is where it is. And he goes, I can't take you into it, honey. And I said, no, you don't understand. This story that I've been telling for about the last 6 or 7 years to these kids, it happened here. And it did. You see, there was a town in the Mosquito Range there in the Rockies. It was formerly called Lorette. It was named as a combination from the names of one of the camper miners' wives, and another one's. And they called it Lorette, but nobody ever really called it Lorette. They called it Buckskin, or they called it Buckskin Joe, after the man who found the gold in the first place, because he always wore buckskin. Now, Buckskin was a pretty typical boom town. It went from 3 to about 100 almost overnight. And in 1874, when J.W. Hilchpath walked into town, the proportion of men to women in that town, well over 1,000, was 73 to 1. So he saw 73 grizzled, hairy, dirty faces before his eyes ever rested on the fair frame of a woman. And he was immediately smitten. Oh, my dear and darling one, you have taken my heart away. Will you marry me? Well, his requests were usually greeted with a slap or a scream. J.W. Hilchpath didn't really have best discipline. It didn't matter if the lady was already married. Didn't matter if she was old enough to be his mother or young enough to be his daughter. It didn't matter if they were the ladies that were working above the saloon. In his eyes, they were all pure as the driven snow and available for him to be in love. He used to go and pick flowers, or he would find iron pyrite or another little stone, and he would take them and he would walk up to the, oh, darling, I do adore you so. Will you marry me? Now, on occasion, I'll move. On occasion, he was greeted by the shotgun of the husband. And this went on, and the ladies were getting very, very frustrated. One day, J.W. was out, well, they figured he was out probably picking flowers or finding another rock to go across another lady. And he was out in the mountains, and he slipped on some loose gravel, fell over a cliff, and died. 2 or 3 days later, they found what remained of him. They knew it was him because they found his hat there. He had a rather distinctive crest on his hat, showing that at one time, at least one time, his family had had some importance. Well, they gathered up J.W. Hilchpath's bones, and they took him to the Buckskin Cemetery, and they buried him, saying final words, and all the women were breathing a sigh of relief because it was done. But they had no more than finished the ceremony and walked back into town when one of the ladies went up above the saloon. She was going to fix her hair. She sat down and started looking in the mirror, and she heard, oh, my dear and darling one, I do adore you so. Will you marry me? And she turned around and she looked, and there, lying on her bed, were the bones of J.W. Hilgepath with flowers in his hand. Well, she immediately screamed at the top of her lungs, and all the men downstairs came running up, saw what was there, gathered him again, took him back to the cemetery, dug it deeper, deposited him, packed it down tight, and left. This did not stop J.W. Hilgepath. He showed up in women's bedrooms, in their kitchens, in their parlors. He showed up one day at the editor of the newspaper's house. She opened up the door and he said, "My darling, I do adore you so." And she slammed the door and he immediately became a pile of bones. But she walked around for weeks going, "Bones, door, bones." And once again, they took him and buried him. They tried everything. They tried burying him deeper and deeper and deeper, and they tried putting rocks over the top of him, but those bones had a way of skittering out over the top. And he kept coming back. Now, what happened to Buckskin is what happened to a lot of boom towns. They went bust. And everybody thought that this would be the end of Hilgepath's roamings. But no, Alma was just down the road, and so was Fairplay. And the women there were troubled just as much by his visits. And the miners told stories of him, and of course you know they would always tell the truth. They told the stories of how one day these two ladies were walking down the street, and along came J.W. Hilgepath, and the top of him went with one, and the other one with the bottom. Well, the men in these other towns were not happy about what was happening to their womenfolk. So they had a meeting because they wanted to get this all taken care of. And they planned and they argued and they schemed until they came up with what they thought was a good idea. They went to the Buckskin Cemetery and they dug up J.W. Hilgepath, which was definitely a switch. And they took him over the mosquito range, and I have to tell you, we did part of that in our car that was not meant for the mountains, and it's not an easy trip. They went over to Leadville. And on the outskirts of Leadville, they found back house number 9. Now around here, we don't call them back houses, we call them outhouses. And they deposited J.W. Hilgepath down in the bottom. Now, he'd been buried much deeper on more than one occasion. But the men had reckoned that any man who figured himself to be a gentleman, which J.W. Hilgepath did, would never call on a lady smelling like that. And sure enough, his visits stopped. But can you imagine what must have gone through the mind of that woman on one late night making a quick trip? And she sat down and she heard, "Oh, my dear."